They laughed at her age. They mocked her obsolete jet. But when hell descended on Afghanistan and high-tech sensors failed, the trapped SEALs didn't need a computer. They needed a miracle. While the young pilots held back, Sarah dove her Warthog straight into the storm where no one else dared to go. Watch until the end to see the exact moment rookie arrogance turned into deep shame, and how the pilot they called Grandma became a legend. From wherever you're watching, let us know in the comments. And if this story has earned you respect, click like so others can find it too. The heat on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight. A heavy, suffocating blanket of dust and jet fuel that pressed down on the lungs and made the air shimmer like a broken television screen, distorting the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush in the distance until they looked like teeth waiting to snap shut. Captain Sarah St. Jenkins walked through this heat with a gait that had been measured and refined over 20 years of service. A slow, conserving rhythm that saved energy and projected a kind of granite stability amidst the chaotic scramble of the flight line. She was 42 years old, her face etched with the fine lines of dehydration and the kind of deep-set exhaustion that sleep could no longer touch. Her flight suit faded to a pale, washed-out sage in places where the harness straps had rubbed against her shoulders for 2 decades. To the young lieutenants and captains of the fighter squadrons, the fast movers who flew the sleek, supersonic F-16 Vipers and the exorbitantly expensive F-35 Lightning IIs, Sarah was a relic. A walking museum piece who belonged in a history book rather than on an active flight line in the 21st century. They stood in clusters near the climate-controlled hangars, their uniforms crisp and tailored, their hair within regulation but styled with a vanity that annoyed her, joking loudly with the easy, unburdened arrogance of men who believed that technology had made them invincible. They looked at Sarah and saw a middle-aged woman climbing into a dinosaur, a slow, ugly, twin-engine beast called the A-10 Thunderbolt II, or as everyone who actually respected it called it, the Warthog. "Hey, Saint, make sure you crank the windows down if it gets too hot up there," one of the F-16 pilots shouted, a young captain with perfect teeth and a call sign, Razor, that he had almost certainly chosen for himself. The group around him erupted in laughter, the sound sharp and metallic against the drone of the ground power units. "Don't break a hip climbing the ladder," another chimed in, his voice dripping with that specific brand of condescension that young men reserve for women they deem irrelevant. Sarah did not turn her head. She did not stop walking. She did not acknowledge them with a glare or a witty retort, because she knew that any reaction would only feed their narrative that she was bitter, old, and out of place. Instead, she absorbed the insult into the vast silent reservoir of patience she had built over a career of being underestimated, letting their laughter wash over her like the hot wind, irrelevant and fleeting. She reached her aircraft, Hog 11, and placed a gloved hand on the cold, scarred titanium of the fuselage, feeling the machine hum under her touch as the crew chief finished the pre-flight checks. The A-10 was not pretty. It was a flying tank, a bathtub of titanium armor wrapped around a massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, a gun the size of a Volkswagen that could fire depleted uranium shells fast enough to cut a tank in half. It had no stealth coating, no supersonic afterburners, no fancy helmet-mounted displays that let her look through the floor of the cockpit. It was loud, mechanical, and unapologetically brutal, a weapon designed for the mud and the blood of the close fight, not for the sterile, beyond visual range engagements the fast movers trained for on their simulators. "They're chirping loud today, Captain," her crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Miller, muttered, as he wiped a smudge of grease from the landing gear strut, his eyes darting toward the F-16 pilots with disdain. "They think speed is the only thing that matters," Sarah replied quietly, her voice calm and steady, devoid of the anger Miller wanted her to feel. "They don't understand that when you're moving at Mach 1, you miss everything that's actually happening on the ground." She climbed the ladder, the metal rungs vibrating slightly, and lowered herself into the cockpit, a space that smelled of old sweat, hydraulic fluid, and ozone, a scent that felt more like home to her than her apartment back in the States ever did. As she strapped in, connecting her oxygen hose and checking the analog gauges that stared back at her like faithful, unblinking eyes, she felt the familiar transformation take hold, the shedding of Sarah Jenkins, the invisible middle-aged woman, and the awakening of Saint, the operator of the deadliest close air support platform ever built. The mission briefing that morning had been a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. The intelligence officers, safe in their air-conditioned trailers with their high-resolution satellite feeds, had designated the Helmand Valley sector as low risk, a routine patrol over dormant villages and empty mountain passes. The F-16s were assigned to high-altitude overwatch, loitering at 25,000 feet where the air was thin and smooth. Their pilots bored before they even took off, complaining about the waste of flight hours. Sarah was assigned the lower tier, the trash-hauling altitude where the air was turbulent and the threat of small arms fire was theoretically non-existent but always possible. "Try to keep up, Saint," Major Rickman, the flight lead for the Vipers, had said with a smirk as they walked out of the briefing room. "We'll do a sweep, scare the goats, and be back in time for the chow hall to open." Sarah had just nodded, her face a mask of professional detachment. "Just keep your radio on the guard frequency, Major," she had said softly. "The mountains have a way of changing the plan." Now as she taxied to the runway, the F-16s roared past her, their afterburners tearing violent orange holes in the shimmering air, shooting into the sky like rockets, eager to escape the grid of the earth. Sarah followed in their wake, her takeoff run long and heavy, the A-10 lumbering into the air with a groan of effort, carrying a full combat load of ordnance that the younger pilots deemed overkill for a milk run. She banked slowly toward the mountains, the world below her transforming from the concrete geometry of the base to the chaotic organic browns and grays of the Afghan wilderness. For 2 hours the mission was exactly what the briefing had promised, a monotonous drone over a landscape that looked as dead as the moon. High above, invisible in the deep blue, the F-16s circled, their pilots chatting on the inter-squadron frequency about transfer requests to bases in Italy or Japan, about cars they wanted to buy, about the tediousness of babysitting a sector where nothing ever happened. Sarah kept her radio silent, tuned to the ground frequencies scanning the static, listening to the ghosts of the valley. She flew at 10,000 feet, her eyes constantly moving from her instruments to the ground, reading the terrain not as a map, but as a story. The way the shadows lengthened in the wadis, the fresh dust settling on a remote trail, the unnatural stillness of a village that should have been bustling with morning market traffic. It was the intuition of a hunter, a skill that could not be coded into a flight computer, earned through thousands of hours of staring at the dirt. Then, the world shifted. It wasn't a gradual change, but a sudden, violent collapse of the atmospheric stability, a common and deadly occurrence in the Hindu Kush that the satellite forecasts often missed. A massive sandstorm, a haboob, rolled off the western peaks like a tidal wave of solid earth, a wall of brown darkness thousands of feet high, colliding with a cold front pushing down from the north. The result was a meteorological bomb. Within minutes, the clear sky was swallowed by a churning, violent soup of dust and cloud, visibility dropping to zero, the turbulence turning the air into a washing machine of unpredictable updrafts and downdrafts. "Visuals lost, visuals lost," Major Rickman's voice crackled in her ear, sounding annoyed rather than concerned, his arrogance shielded by his altitude. "This is Viper Lead. We are punching up to 35,000 to get above this mess. Saint, I suggest you RTB, return to base. That flying bathtub isn't rated for this kind of chop and you can't see anything anyway." Sarah was about to acknowledge, about to turn her aircraft around and head for the safety of Bagram, when a sound cut through the static on the emergency guard frequency, a sound that stopped her breath. It wasn't the polished, calm voice of a pilot. It was the jagged, breathless, guttural scream of a man looking death in the face. "Any station? Any station? This is Viking 2-2. We are taking effective fire, multiple casualties. We are pinned, I repeat, we are pinned. Grid 4-4 Zulu." The transmission was distorted by the background noise of heavy machine gun fire, the chaotic thump of explosions, and the screaming of wounded men. It was a SEAL team call sign, a unit operating in the deep black, a mission that hadn't been on the morning briefing because it didn't exist on paper. Sarah's hand tightened on the stick, her knuckles turning white. "Station calling, this is Hog 1-1, I read you loud and clear," she transmitted, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, icy calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos in her headset. "Viper led. Did you copy that traffic?" "We heard it, Saint," Rickman replied, his voice tighter now, the boredom gone. replaced by the frantic energy of someone who realizes they are useless. But we can't see a damn thing. The cloud deck is solid from 12,000 feet down to the deck. My sensors are washing out. I can't drop ordnance blind. I'd kill the friendlies. We have no firing solution. We are taking RPGs, the SEAL screaming again, his voice cracking with desperation. We have high ground on 3 sides. They are swarming us. We have maybe 2 minutes before we are overrun. Where is the air? Where is the goddamn air? Sarah looked at her altimeter, then at the swirling wall of brown and gray below her wing, a cauldron of death that no pilot in their right mind would enter. The F-16s were right. Technically, it was suicide. Their high-tech targeting pods were blinded by the dust. Their speed meant that if they dipped below the clouds, they would smash into a mountain before they could react. They were Ferraris in a swamp. But the A-10 wasn't a Ferrari. It was a mule. And Sarah wasn't a rock star. She was a guardian. Viper lead, stay high and relay comms with command, Sarah said, her voice devoid of hesitation. Hog 1-1 is going in. Saint, don't be an idiot, Rickman barked, the veneer of rank slipping. You have 0 visibility. The valley floor is narrow, you'll smear yourself on a cliff face. Abort, that is an order. Sarah ignored him. She reached up and flipped the master arm switch to on. She cut the throttle, extended the speed brakes, the barn doors on her wings, and tipped the nose of the warthog toward the abyss. Hog 1-1 is committing, she said, and then she stopped listening to the radio chatter from above. The turbulence hit her like a physical blow, a giant hand grabbing the aircraft and shaking it violently. The cockpit darkened as she plunged into the storm, the sunlight vanishing, replaced by a suffocating brown twilight. The rain of sand hissed against the canopy. She was flying on instruments and memory now, visualizing the 3D map of the valley she had studied earlier, counting the seconds, feeling the pressure changes. Down she went. 8,000, 6,000, 4,000. The radar altimeter began to scream, the proximity warnings flashing red lights that reflected in her visor. She was flying blind into a canyon, trusting her life to the machine and her own sense of space. At 1,000 feet above ground level, she broke out of the thickest layer into a horrific hazy twilight. The visibility was barely a quarter mile, a tunnel of dust and wind. And there, in the center of the dry riverbed, she saw the flashes. It was a kill zone. The SEAL team was huddled behind a cluster of boulders in the center of the wadi, completely exposed. On the ridges above them, hundreds of muzzle flashes sparkled like fireflies in the gloom. The Taliban fighters had set a perfect ambush using the storm as cover, knowing the American jets couldn't touch them. They were moving in for the finish, sprinting down the slopes, confident, screaming their victory. They hadn't counted on the warthog. They hadn't counted on Sarah. Viking 2-2, this is Hog 1-1. I am 30 seconds out. I see the tracers. Mark your position with IR strobe or smoke. Do it now, Sarah commanded. Pop smoke. Pop smoke. She heard the SEAL leader yell over the radio. A moment later, a plume of purple smoke erupted from the center of the desperate circle of men. It was dangerously close to the enemy. Danger close, Sarah whispered to herself, her eyes narrowing. She was too low for missiles. The blast radius would kill the SEALs. She was too close for bombs. There was only one tool left, the gun. She lined up the nose of the plane, aiming not at a specific man but at the geometry of the ambush. She had to thread a needle while riding a bucking bronco in a hurricane. She ignored the turbulence. She ignored the proximity alarms screaming that the canyon walls were closing in. She focused on the reticle. The enemy was closing to within 50 meters of the SEALs. Hog 1-1, fire, fire, they are on top of us, the SEAL screamed. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The aircraft didn't just fire. It stopped in midair. The recoil of the GAU-8 was so powerful it slowed the plane's forward momentum. The sound was not a bang. It was a tearing of the fabric of reality, a deep, resonant brrrt that sounded like the earth itself was ripping open. A stream of tracers the size of milk bottles poured from the nose of the plane, a laser beam of lead. The rounds hit the ground a split second before the sound arrived, churning the rocky slope into a spray of shrapnel and dust. Sarah didn't just strafe. She painted the ridgeline with death. She walked the fire right up to the edge of the purple smoke, so close that the SEALs would have felt the heat of the depleted uranium shells passing overhead. The psychological impact was immediate. The enemy attack collapsed instantly. Men who had been sprinting forward simply evaporated or threw themselves to the ground, terrified by the dragon that had appeared from the storm. Sarah pulled back on the stick with both hands, the G-forces slamming her down into the seat as she banked hard to avoid the canyon wall, the belly of her plane scraping the tops of the scrub brush. She was so low she could see the color of the rocks. "Status?" she asked, her breathing heavy, fighting the aircraft to stay level in the violent wind. For a second there was only static, then a voice, shaky, broken, filled with a kind of religious awe. "Good hits. Good hits. Target suppressed. Holy cow. You cleared the ridge, ma'am. You cleared the whole damn ridge." But it wasn't over. "We have critical wounded," the SEAL said. "We can't move. They are regrouping on the north side. We need cover for extraction." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said. And she didn't. For the next 45 minutes, Captain Sarah Jenkins put on a display of aerial mastery that no simulator could teach. The F-16s circled helplessly above the clouds, listening to the battle they couldn't join. They heard the strain in Sarah's voice as she pulled high G-turns in the narrow valley. They heard the relentless brrrr-tee of the gun as she beat back wave after wave of attackers. They heard the SEALs go from terrified to emboldened, calling out targets, cheering as the ugly, slow, low-flying plane decimated the enemy positions. Sarah flew until her arms burned from fighting the stick. She flew until her fuel gauge was flashing red, dipping into the emergency reserves. She flew until the extraction helicopters, emboldened by her relentless cover, dared to dive into the storm to pick up the team. "Hog 1-1, this is Dustoff. We have the package. We are lifting off. Thanks for keeping the wolves at bay." "Copy, Dustoff. I'll cover your 6 on the way out," Sarah said. Only when the helicopters were clear of the valley did she finally pull up, climbing out of the soup, her engines whining in protest. She broke through the cloud deck into the blinding, brilliant sunlight at 20,000 feet. The F-16s were waiting for her. She expected a reprimand. She expected Major Rickman to tear into her for violating safety minimums, for risking a multi-million-dollar aircraft, for disobeying a direct order to abort. "Hog 1-1, forming up on your wing," Rickman's voice came over the radio. It was different now. The sneering edge was gone. The arrogance had evaporated. It was quiet, deferential, almost apologetic. 2 sleek F-16s slid into position beside her, not speeding past but extending their flaps, slowing down to match her lumbering speed. They didn't lead her. They escorted her. It was a formation of honor. They guided her back to Bagram, protecting the wounded warrior. The landing was rough. Her hydraulics were overheating, her tires were worn, and she was physically trembling from the adrenaline dump. But she put the Warthog down on the concrete with a solid, definitive thud. She taxied to the revetment, the heat of the afternoon still baking the tarmac, but the atmosphere had changed. As she shut down the engines, the whine dying away to a high-pitched whistle and then silence, she saw the crowd. Usually, a returning pilot was met by just the crew chief. Today, the flight line was packed. She unbuckled, her body aching, her flight suit soaked through with sweat, her hair matted against her forehead. She felt every minute of her 42 years. She climbed down the ladder, her boots hitting the concrete with a heavy clack. She expected to walk alone to the debriefing room to face the consequences. Instead, she stopped. The SEALs were there. They had just offloaded from the helicopters, dirty, bloody, bandages wrapped around heads and arms, their gear torn and covered in the dust of the valley. They were hardened men, operators who had seen the worst the world had to offer. And standing in a semicircle around them were the fast movers, the young lieutenants and captains who had laughed at her that morning. They stood with their hands out of their pockets, silent, looking at the soot-stained nose of the A-10, at the empty shell casings piled high near the cannon, and then at Sarah. The SEAL team leader, a giant of a man with a thick beard and his arm in a sling, stepped forward. He bypassed the colonel who had come out to greet them. He bypassed the F-16 pilots who were trying to look invisible. He walked straight to Sarah. He stopped 2 feet from her. He smelled of cordite and dried blood. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the gender, past the age, past the rank. He looked at the butterfly tattoo on her forearm, the one the boys had joked about. And he didn't smile. He nodded. "We thought we were dead," he said, his voice raspy, carrying across the silent tarmac. "We heard the jets above us and we knew they couldn't see us. We were writing our final letters in our heads and then you showed up." He paused, swallowing hard. "You answered the call when the smart move was to go home. You came down into the mud with us. You saved 20 men today, Captain." He didn't call her Saint with a sneer. He didn't call her Grandma. He straightened his battered body and snapped a crisp, slow salute. It wasn't a mandatory military courtesy. It was a gesture of profound brotherhood. Sarah stood frozen for a moment. She didn't make a speech. She didn't look at the F-16 pilots to see their reaction. She simply returned the salute, her hand steady, her eyes clear. "The warthog likes the mud," she said softly. "Just doing my job." Major Rickman walked up then, looking at the ground, struggling to find the words. He looked at the SEALs, then at Sarah. We couldn't get a lock, Sarah. We were blind." It was an admission of total failure, a dismantling of the ego. Sarah looked at him, and for the first time she saw him not as an arrogant boy, but as a pilot who had learned a hard lesson about the difference between technology and warfare. "I know," she said without malice. "That's why we have both." She picked up her helmet bag and began the long walk back to the operations building. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the eyes of the entire base on her back, but this time, there was no mockery. There was only the heavy, reverent silence that follows the revelation of true competence. The invisible professional had been seen, not because she demanded it, but because when the sky fell, she was the one holding it up.